This will shock you. A smiling, well-liked contractor and party clown hid a nightmare beneath his home. Behind the friendly face of John Wayne Gacy lay a labyrinth of secrets, bodies, and unimaginable cruelty. The discovery of what was buried in his suburban crawl space would horrify the entire nation. Long before his name became synonymous with horror, John Wayne Gacy was known as the neighbor everyone seemed to trust. In the suburbs of Norwood Park, just outside Chicago, he was a familiar face at block parties, charity events, and local Democratic fundraisers. He worked as a construction contractor, volunteered at hospitals, and even dressed up as a clown at children's parties. To the casual observer, Gacy represented an almost picture-perfect image of small-town reliability. But behind the easy smile and the painted red nose, something monstrous waited in the dark. Gacy's early life gave glimpses of the man he would become. Born into a working-class family, he grew up with an abusive father whose violent temper left deep emotional scars. Gacy craved approval but rarely received it. As a teenager, he struggled with his identity, his sense of self fractured between what he wanted to show the world and what he kept hidden. He learned how to charm, how to play the role people expected him to play. It would become one of his most dangerous weapons. As a young man, Gacy became active in his community. He worked hard, joined civic groups, and built a reputation as a man who could get things done. But beneath this polished exterior, troubling behavior surfaced. He had his first criminal conviction in Iowa in the late 1960s for sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison but was released after less than 2 years for what authorities then called good behavior. It was a decision that, in retrospect, would haunt everyone who had believed he could be reformed. Upon his release, Gacy returned to Illinois and carefully rebuilt his image. He founded a successful construction company. He bought a modest house at 8200 West Summerdale Avenue, a place that seemed like any other on the quiet street. He became a precinct captain in local politics, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and even met First Lady Rosalind Carter at a political event. A photograph that would later become one of the most chilling images in American true crime history. Gacy created a new identity for himself, one that disarmed suspicion at every turn. One of his most infamous personas was Pogo the Clown. Dressed in a red and white costume, with a painted grin and balloon animals in hand, he entertained children at parties and charity events. People saw him as harmless, even lovable. But for Gacy, the clown mask was more than a costume. It was a shield, and a tool to hide the predator beneath. By the mid-1970s, young men and teenage boys in the Chicago area began to disappear. Many of them were runaways, hitchhikers, or working-class youths with few people in positions of power to speak for them. Some were last seen near bus stops. Others vanished after job interviews. There were whispers, worried families, and police reports, but in many cases the investigation stalled. The victims came from groups society often overlooked, and Gacy counted on that indifference to keep hunting. Gacy's method was precise. He often lured his victims by offering them work with his construction company or promising them money. Once they stepped through the front door of his house, they entered a world they would never escape. Behind that door, the friendly contractor became something else entirely. He bound them, assaulted them, and then killed them. But what truly shocked the world later was not just the number of lives he took, it was where he hid their bodies. As disappearances mounted, suspicion began to build, though Gacy remained a step ahead of most investigations. He knew how to appear cooperative, how to talk his way out of questions. Police spoke with him on several occasions, but with no solid evidence, the investigations faded away. It wasn't until December of 1978 that everything changed. On December 11th, a teenage boy named Robert Peast disappeared after telling a co-worker he was going to talk to a contractor about a job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert's disappearance sparked immediate concern because he came from a stable family and was not the type to run away. His parents pushed authorities to act quickly. This time, police listened. Detectives visited Gacy's house under the pretense of questioning him about Robert's disappearance. Gacy greeted them with his usual polite smile, invited them in, and answered questions as if nothing were wrong. But something about his behavior unsettled the officers. They left with suspicions and soon obtained a search warrant. The first search did not reveal bodies, but it revealed enough to sound alarms. Investigators found suspicious items, including handcuffs, clothing that didn't fit Gacy, and a strange odor emanating from the crawl space beneath the house. It was dismissed at first as sewer problems, but the smell lingered in their minds. The officers left that night without making an arrest, but the investigation had officially turned toward Gacy. As the days passed, detectives kept him under constant surveillance. Gacy, confident in his ability to manipulate people, even invited officers to dinner and played psychological games with them. But behind the scenes, the case against him was growing. Robert Peast's disappearance had connected threads that investigators had previously missed. Names of other missing young men began to resurface. The cracks in Gacy's facade were widening. What neighbors saw as an eccentric but friendly contractor was about to be exposed as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Beneath the house on Summerdale Avenue, beneath the floorboards where children once walked and families passed by without a thought, an unimaginable horror waited to be unearthed. By the winter of 1978, the once quiet neighborhood around 8200 West Summerdale Avenue had become the focus of an intense police operation. The disappearance of Robert Peast, a well-liked teenage boy from a local pharmacy, had triggered an urgency that earlier missing persons cases had lacked. Detectives were no longer looking at Gacy as just another eccentric neighbor. They were looking at him as a prime suspect in what was beginning to look like something far darker. The police surveillance of John Wayne Gacy became constant. Detectives followed his every move, noting his increasingly erratic behavior. In the beginning, Gacy played it cool. He invited officers into restaurants, bought them meals, and tried to charm them as he had so many others before. He joked, made small talk, and acted as though the entire situation was just a misunderstanding. But as the days dragged on, that mask of control began to slip. He started drinking heavily, driving aimlessly for hours, and talking about his life in cryptic fragments, as though he knew his time was running out. While the surveillance team watched Gacy's behavior unravel, investigators quietly built their case. They obtained a second search warrant for his house, this time determined to look deeper. It was not the clown costume or the friendly neighborhood contractor persona they were confronting anymore. It was the man behind the mask. On December 21st, detectives entered Gacy's house once again. The foul, pungent odor that had been dismissed during the first search now hung heavy in the air. Officers pried open the entrance to the crawl space beneath the house. What they found changed the course of the investigation forever. Beneath the wooden beams, wrapped in layers of mud and decay, lay the remains of young men and boys who had vanished over the years. Investigators began carefully excavating the space, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. At first they found a single body, then another, and another. The number began to rise quickly. The crawl space was not just a hiding place, it was a graveyard. Gacy was arrested shortly after. He offered little resistance, as if the weight of what was hidden under his house had already crushed any remaining hope of denial. In custody, his behavior swung wildly between arrogance, exhaustion, and moments of chilling calm. When confronted with the mounting evidence, Gacy began to talk. His confession was as horrifying as it was casual. He told detectives how he lured young men to his home with promises of work or money. He described a so-called handcuff trick, a staged game in which he would restrain his victims before assaulting and killing them. His voice remained eerily detached, as though he were describing ordinary events. As the digging continued at the house on Summerdale Avenue, the number of bodies climbed. The crawl space yielded more than 20 corpses. Several others were found in nearby rivers, where Gacy admitted to dumping them when he ran out of room beneath his home. The forensic work was slow, deliberate, and emotionally grueling. Each body represented a stolen life, many of them young men whose disappearances had barely made headlines when they vanished. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. News vans surrounded the house as law enforcement vehicles went in and out. Reporters broadcast live updates as more and more remains were uncovered. This was no longer a local missing persons case. It had become a national horror story. The idea that so many murders could take place in a quiet suburban neighborhood, just minutes away from schools and family homes, was almost impossible for the public to comprehend. Families who had lost sons and brothers years earlier began calling police lines, desperate for answers. Photographs of missing young men flooded investigators' desks. The slow, painful process of identifying the victims began. Dental records, medical reports, and personal effects were used to match names to the remains. Each confirmation shattered another family's world. What added a layer of deep outrage to the unfolding tragedy was the realization that many of these disappearances had not been treated with urgency at the time. Many of Gacy's victims were young men from working-class or marginalized communities. Several had been dismissed as runaways. Gacy had counted on that societal indifference to keep hunting. In the days following his arrest, John Wayne Gacy became a household name. Newspapers branded him the Killer Clown, emphasizing the twisted juxtaposition between his cheerful clown persona and the horror beneath his home. Television networks aired nightly updates, showing images of police tents, crime scene tape, and grim-faced detectives carrying evidence bags out of the house. As the body count climbed toward 30, fear and disbelief rippled through the country. How could a man who entertained children, hosted political events, and lived among neighbors for years commit such atrocities without being caught? How could a horror of this magnitude exist behind the walls of an ordinary suburban home? Inside police stations, detectives worked around the clock. The smell of decomposition clung to their clothes long after they left the crime scene. Some would later speak of the psychological toll it took to spend weeks cataloging death at such a scale. Forensic specialists struggled to keep up with the flood of evidence. The Chicago coroner's office had never seen anything like it. Gacy's cooperation with law enforcement was as chilling as his crimes. He guided investigators through his actions, describing where and how he buried each victim, almost with a sense of pride in his ability to recall the details. It was not the confession of a broken man. It was the recounting of a predator who had spent years believing he would never be caught. By the end of December, law enforcement had recovered 29 bodies, 26 of them buried in and around his home. The remaining were pulled from the nearby Des Plaines River. The final toll would settle at 33 confirmed victims. As the new year approached, the suburban neighborhood that had once been ordinary now stood as a symbol of unspeakable horror. The Gacy house was no longer just a crime scene. It was a graveyard. And the story that was beginning to unfold would expose not just the monster who lived there, but the cracks in the systems that had allowed him to thrive for so long. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy in December of 1978 shocked the nation. But the full reckoning came later. Inside a crowded courtroom where the smiling face of a suburban neighbor was revealed to be the mask of a monster. The trial would become one of the most chilling legal spectacles in American criminal history. It wasn't just a case of multiple murders. It was a confrontation with the unimaginable. The fact that 33 young men had been killed by someone who lived right in plain sight. The trial began in February of 1980. Security was unlike anything the Cook County Courthouse had ever seen. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. Reporters packed the press gallery, and outside, crowds gathered every day, chanting, holding signs, and demanding justice. People who had lived near Gacy's house watched the proceedings with disbelief, still trying to reconcile the friendly contractor and volunteer clown they had known with the sadistic killer described in the indictments. The prosecution built its case methodically. They laid out the evidence with clinical precision. 26 victims buried in the crawl space, 3 more buried on the property, and 4 dumped in the Des Plaines River. Photographs, forensic reports, and expert testimony painted a picture of a man who had acted deliberately, carefully, and without remorse for years. They described how Gacy lured young men with promises of work or money, used handcuffs as part of his so-called trick, and then assaulted, tortured, and killed them before disposing of their bodies under his house. The defense strategy centered on insanity. Gacy's attorneys argued that no sane person could commit such atrocities, that he suffered from multiple personality disorders, and that he did not fully comprehend the criminality of his actions. They portrayed him as a man with fractured identities, the cheerful clown on the outside, the killer buried deep within. But prosecutors countered with powerful evidence of premeditation, the careful concealment of the bodies, the calculated use of his house as a killing ground, and his ability to maintain a public image of trustworthiness for years. Witness testimony further shattered the defense narrative. Investigators described in grim detail the excavation of Gacy's crawl space, the process of removing body after body, the smell, the weight of the earth, and the faces of victims slowly reclaimed through forensic work. Family members of the victims took the stand, holding photographs of young men whose lives had been stolen. They spoke of sons and brothers who had dreams, who were loved, and whose disappearances had left gaping holes in their lives. Their words brought a human weight to the horror that numbers alone could never convey. The media coverage was relentless. Every day, television broadcasts replayed images of Gacy sitting almost motionless in court, occasionally smiling, occasionally whispering to his attorneys. That smile became infamous, a chilling reminder of how ordinary evil can look. Editorials debated whether the death penalty was appropriate, whether Gacy's mental state should spare his life, and what this case revealed about failures in policing and social structures. The jury deliberated for only a short time. On March 13, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on 33 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to death, 12 separate death sentences, to be carried out by lethal injection. The courtroom erupted in a wave of emotion. Some cried, some cheered, some simply stood in stunned silence, as if even a guilty verdict could never fully contain the magnitude of what had happened. Gacy was transferred to death row at Menard Correctional Center, but the story didn't end there. For 14 years he lived under tight security, filing appeal after appeal, claiming innocence one day and admitting guilt the next. In interviews, he often downplayed his crimes, painting himself as a victim of the system or blaming others. This grotesque manipulation frustrated victims' families and infuriated the public. While the appeals dragged on, the myth of the killer clown grew, embedding itself into American cultural memory. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. Outside the prison, Hundreds gathered in the night, some holding candles, others chanting and celebrating. When the official word came at 12:58 a.m. that Gacy was dead, the crowd erupted. For many families, it was a moment of closure, though nothing could ever truly heal what had been taken from them. The legacy of the Gacy case is as complex as it is horrifying. It revealed not only the depths of one man's cruelty, but also systemic flaws in how society handles missing persons cases. Many of Gacy's victims were young men from marginalized backgrounds whose disappearances were not given the urgency they deserved. The case forced police departments nationwide to reevaluate how they track missing individuals, how they communicate across jurisdictions, and how they handle crimes involving vulnerable communities. The Gacy investigation also advanced forensic science. The sheer number of victims required coordinated identification efforts that stretched local resources to their limits. Forensic odontology and early DNA methods played critical roles in identifying the remains, establishing new investigative protocols that would shape future serial killer cases. Gacy's case, like those of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, marked a turning point in how law enforcement approached pattern crimes, missing persons, and criminal profiling. Culturally, the image of John Wayne Gacy left scars that went far beyond the courtroom. His alter ego, Pogo the Clown, turned an innocent figure of childhood entertainment into a symbol of terror. The idea that a man who entertained children at parties could simultaneously bury bodies beneath his house shattered a public sense of safety. His story became a cautionary tale. Evil does not always come with warning signs. Sometimes it wears a painted smile. For the families of the 33 young men who never came home, the case remains a wound that time cannot close. Many of them fought for years to ensure their loved ones' names would not be forgotten. Memorials and public records now stand as reminders of those who were lost, emphasizing their lives over the man who took them. Today, more than 4 decades after his arrest, John Wayne Gacy remains one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. His name is synonymous with cruelty, manipulation, and the hidden darkness that can lurk behind ordinary faces. But beyond the headlines, beyond the fear, his story continues to serve as a warning that monsters do not live only in the shadows. Sometimes they live next door.